Greetings. My name is Dr. Anthony Dixon. I'm a public historian that concentrates on the African diaspora and African American history and culture. I was asked to take a few moments to talk about African American inventors, inventions, and their impact in the country or on the country, particularly looking at two inventors, Benjamin Banneker and George Washington Carver. However, I always like to start at the beginning, and the beginning is actually African ingenuity. There's always been this talk, and now, more recently, it has become a little more popular, particularly here in the state of Florida, about the ideas that our ancestors enslaved men actually taught them skills. And we know that this is by far an untrue. One particular example that comes to mind immediately is the fact that in West Africa there is a region that is called the Rice Coast. Therefore, how can we say that the enslavement, particularly in the Low Country, where rice was primarily grown, taught these Africans those skills when there's a rice coast that exists in Africa? So common sense tells us that this is not the truth. Therefore, I want to give a little background on how African ingenuity has always existed in this country, but oftentimes Africans and their descendants, African Americans, were not given any credit. During our ancestors' enslavement, anything that our ancestors created by law and socially belonged to their quote-unquote master or those who enslaved them. So any ingenuity, any inventions, anything that came up that would help the processes thereof still technically and by law belong to the slave owner or enslaved owner. And so we see in history different things that we even still utilize today being invented or created by someone that was enslaved, yet the credit has gone to someone else. Quickly, two quick examples. The quote-unquote secret recipe for Kentucky Fried Chicken was actually created by an enslaved woman. A very popular brand of alcohol that we still buy today was created by an enslaved man. But again, even by law, those inventions and the credit thereof went to those who enslaved them. So as we fast forward in time, we start seeing different things that come arise, whether it's out of the agrarian society, primarily in the Southeast, or plantation society, or even things within the mercantile and industrialization of America, primarily in the Northeast. There are countless of ideas, countless of inventions that African Americans would never receive any credit for. And there was a full process in place that guaranteed that. As we move forward in time, yet again, as I previously said, we come across during the enslavement period, but at the same time, the movement toward abolitionism. And so that brings me to our first primary inventor that we want to discuss, and that is Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker was born free. He had the ability, unlike most African Americans at the time, to go to school. And in that process, it was discovered that he was highly advanced in mathematics. It got to the point where it was even a novelty for not only African Americans, but whites as well, to ask him what they considered very arduous or hard mathematical equation, and Benjamin Banneker would stand there and solve them almost instantly. And so he became very popular. And because of this, he was given opportunities to advance his education. And he advanced that education to the point where he was and became known as an advanced mathematician and eventually an engineer. Now, what we find is, as Benjamin Banneker began to advance himself and his popularity increased, he went on to do what was considered very, very abnormal, highly unique, and with whites incredulous. And that was, he created an almanac. And in that almanac, which ended up actually being compared to Benjamin Franklin's almanac, was studied. It became so popular that Thomas Jefferson took the almanac, sent the almanac to the National Academy of Science, the International, Academy of Science, which was at that time in Paris, France, for it to be scrutinized and examined for accuracy. The end result was that almanac was proved with an astounding rate of accuracy. And Benjamin Banneker and his almanac received international recognition and praise. From that, Benjamin Banneker would go on to become one of the engineers for the development of the city of Washington, D.C. And here, again, his advanced scientific knowledge and techniques placed him in a high caliber as well as position among the engineers who were working on the project. Now, what I just discussed is normally what is given to us in grade school and taught to us. But there's also one other facet that he became involved with, he became known for, but is left out of our grade school textbooks. And that is the fact that he became a prominent abolitionist. And the reason he became so prominent is because not only his very existence and who he was, but also his ability to articulate his ideas challenged one of the strongest pro-slavery arguments, and that was that Africans and their descendants lacked the intelligence and were intellectually inferior. And so Benjamin Banneker challenged that by his deeds as well as his action. He was even able to have serious conversations with Thomas Jefferson. And in those conversations, most of them by letters, Thomas Jefferson himself would go on to admit the fallacies in these ideas of quote-unquote Negro intellectual inferiority. And so what we learn then is that Benjamin Banneker was a leader for the country in his scientific advancements, but he was also a leader socially in challenging and helping gain the momentum of abolitionism. And again, this was particularly because his mere presence, his intelligence, and his articulation shot down, so to speak, one of the primary ideologies behind pro-slavery. Now, as we move on and we get toward the end of slavery and we move past the Civil War into Reconstruction, we learn that the same ideologies in terms of being able to claim other people's work and ingenuity simply carried on through different tactics. So when we get to the Reconstruction period in the late 1800s, a new tactic was created. And that tactic was called the quote-unquote apprenticeship. And they would take young African-American males in general, young African-American women, and place them in these substandard working positions by using the title apprentice. And so here again, all the work, all the ingenuity of the apprentice would then be claimed by those they worked for. And so that places us in another time frame, but it also gives us another prime example, which of course leads us to the second inventor that we are focusing on, and that is George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver grew up just at the turn of the Civil War and Reconstruction. He was born enslaved, but freedom came while he was a small child. So he was placed in this apprenticeship position. And in this apprenticeship position, he first became quite interested and fascinated with cooking. He was deemed too small, too frail to actually work in the fields within the sharecropping system. So he was placed in an apprenticeship position in the house and taught to cook. His love for cooking then led to his ideas and love for creating different herbs and spices, which ultimately led him to botany. And through his apprenticeship, he was also given opportunities to advance his education. And he did so, becoming a botanist, an herbalist, and going on to get advanced science degrees. Now, again, as we have been given information on George Washington Carver, his story, his work at Tuskegee Institute, and particularly his work with the peanut. But there's also, again, there are things that he also did socially and economically, specifically for African Americans, that was left out of the textbooks. George Washington Carver created many helpful things within botany, from the peanut oil to all of the uses of peanuts, but also he created fertilizer and other things that would advance plant growth. But what we find is that once those things became patented, once they began to get a patent for those different items, the commerce and the mercantilism, or the business part of it, was created such that African American farmers were not able to either acquire them, or it was priced for African American farmers such that they could not afford them. And so George Washington Carver recognized the fact that although he, as an African American, had created these inventions, had created these different techniques, created these different products to advance farming, they couldn't be used by his own people. Therefore, George Washington Carver went back to the drawing board, so to speak, and he began to create alternatives. These alternatives were utilizing things that could be utilized by those who could not afford the finished products that he had previously created. In other words, in our day and time, we would consider them generics, but these quote-unquote generics that he created were just as good as the original products he created. He simply used ingredients to which African Americans could get their hands on. So his inventions were actually 2 times fold. He created those which were then taken and selectively sold and purposely sold to whites and denied to African Americans. Then he created alternate products that African Americans could afford and use and advance their farming and their farming techniques just the same. And so what these inventions and what we're actually saying is that these inventions that he created socially, economically, and overall scientifically helped keep African Americans in the loop and with the ability to compete in the farming industry. And so again, these are the things that we're talking about, going back from the ideas of enslavement, where the ingenuity, the products, the ideologies, all of that belong to those who enslaved others, to a period where this idea of apprenticeship simply does the same job. Now I want you to understand something, and I think it's important to understand. The idea of apprenticeship wasn't just something that was held in the agrarian society and in the South. In the early 1900s, in the teens and into the early 1920s, the ideas of apprenticeship spread even more and expanded. And it expanded actually throughout the country. This happens with particularly the election of Woodrow Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson becomes president, he takes the ideas of segregation and he takes the ideas of apprenticeship to Washington, D.C. And under the same ideals and the same notions, he simply changes the words, hoping that there would be a different connotation accepted by the North. And so instead of using the word apprentice, they began to use the word clerk. What we find is Woodrow Wilson goes into Washington, D.C. He begins to segregate the bathrooms. That's the social part of it. But he takes those African Americans who are in positions, who are doing things, governmental processes and things of that nature, and he removes them out of that position, and then he moves them and de-elevates them into a position that he calls clerks, and he places a white person in that same position that he removed the African American. And so now all of the work that the African American is still having to do is now being claimed by the person that held the title of that position. and the quote-unquote clerk is simply deemed as the assistant. But in actuality, that African American is the one doing all of the work, while the white American who holds the title gets all of the credit. So you see, this whole process, and underlining, it is the same ideology, same things happening. It's just the tactics and the names are being changed. Now, what we find when we move forward throughout the 19th century and even till today is the same tactics, just done by different methodologies. We find in factories, we find even at educational institutions, people are coming up with inventions. Not just African Americans anymore, but people in general in the workforce are coming up with inventions. But whatever institution or company they work for legally is given the right to the patent. And so we recognize that is not something that we would like to consider fair. And we see instances throughout the 20th century where people are fighting the odds. They're going to get patents and things of that nature, and they're being able to take these companies and institutions to court. They don't always win, but we see them pushing back now. Sometimes we have even seen those who have won. Most recently in my mind, I can remember about approximately 15 to maybe 20 years ago, late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a case with the university here in Florida, and there was a grad student that created an invention. And because he was a grad student and he was working in the department at the university claimed the patent, and so they went to court. And sadly enough, the court sided with the academic institution, and they basically told the institution that the patent was theirs when they were ready to apply for it. And they went further to tell the graduate student that they could not apply for that patent. Well, in this case, the graduate student walked out of that courtroom and he went and applied for that patent, and he received the patent. Months later, when the university went to apply for the same patent, they discovered that they couldn't get it now. And so they took the graduate student back to court. When they took the student back to court, and I can't remember whether or not he had graduated by this time, but when he goes back to court, he is now criminally charged by defying a court order. And so he was actually imprisoned for this act. He went on to prison, and if I recall, he spent less than 18 months imprisoned for getting the patent. But when all the information came out, it was discovered that the patent was worth millions. So you see, this whole ideology in America where people are legally obtaining the right to claim other people's ingenuity has always existed from the very beginning. And in the very beginning, it solely, at some periods of time, rested on African ingenuity. And then, of course, there were periods where it rested on others as well. But make no mistake about it, African ingenuity is what was utilized to get plantation society going, thriving, and actually sustaining this country for various periods throughout its history. Thank you.